The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 11 years before anyone answered it. Jake Okoro almost didn't. Deep space salvage ran on math, not mercy, and the numbers on this one were bad. An 11-year-old signal meant a dead ship, and a dead ship that far past the trade lanes usually meant nothing worth the fuel to reach it. But the registry code kept snagging on something in the back of his mind, a pattern he couldn't place, and Jake had learned a long time ago not to ignore that particular itch. He changed course. The ship that grew in his viewport 3 days later wasn't a wreck. It was a coffin. Its hull was the color of old bone, its running lights long dead, and it drifted with the slow, directionless tumble of something that had stopped mattering to anyone a long time ago. Jake's scanner painted it in soft gray outlines and returned a single, unhelpful word for vessel classification. Unknown. He circled it twice before he found the breach. A narrow scar along the underside, sealed crudely with foam patch that had long since crystallized and cracked. Someone had tried to keep this ship alive. Someone had failed. "Talk to me," Jake said to his own ship, more habit than command. The console answered in scrolling text because talking back had never been in the budget. Atmosphere reading trace. Power signature, minimal, life support only. Occupants, unknown. He should have logged it and moved on. Ships like this had a smell to them, even through a suit, even through vacuum, the smell of somebody else's tragedy, the kind that followed you home if you got too close. But 11 years was a long time for a beacon to keep calling out to nobody, and Jake had spent enough nights alone in his own ship to know what that kind of waiting did to a person. He suited up and went in. The interior confirmed what the hull had promised. This had been someone's property, not their home. The corridor was lined with cells, narrow, coffin-shaped units stacked 3 high, most of them dark, a few flickering with the dying amber glow of failing stasis fields. Jake's light swept across a handwritten placard bolted to the wall, characters he didn't recognize, and beneath it, in the crude block trade script used across a dozen systems for exactly this purpose. Live cargo. Do not disturb. His jaw tightened. He'd salvaged worse. He told himself that as he moved deeper, checking each unit, cataloging the dead with a clinical detachment that was mostly a lie. 14 units, 14 bodies, preserved by failing stasis long after their hearts had stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The 15th unit was still running. The field inside flickered violet-white, and beneath it, curled on her side like she was only sleeping, was something that had never been human and had clearly, once, been beautiful in whatever way her people measured such things. Now her right hand ended in a cauterized stump wrapped in stiffened bandage. A long-healed scar ran from her temple to her jaw, and where her left eye should have been there was a smooth patch of grafted skin, paler than the rest of her. Symbols were burned. Not tattooed. Burned. Across her collarbone in a language Jake couldn't read but understood anyway. The way you understand a brand. Her remaining eye opened. She didn't scream. That was the thing that stayed with him afterward. She didn't scream. Didn't flinch. Didn't do any of the things a person does when they wake to a stranger's light in their face. She just looked at him with the flat, waiting patience of someone who had run out of reactions a long time ago. Jake raised both hands, empty, slow. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. And then, feeling foolish, added, "I don't even know if you understand me." A pause. Then, in a voice scraped thin from disuse, in trade common accented in a way he'd never heard before, "It doesn't matter if I understand. Are you buying or collecting?" "Neither," Jake said. "Everyone is one or the other." She said it like a fact of physics, not an opinion. "Which manifest am I on?" Jake looked past her, at the stasis unit's cracked readout, at the burned symbols on her collarbone, and understood, with the slow, sick clarity of a man realizing he stepped into something much bigger than a supply run, that he had no idea what he'd found. "You're not on any manifest," he said. "Not one I'm reading, anyway." Her name, when she finally gave it, was Velnix Thorin, and she gave it the way someone hands over a weapon they no longer trust themselves to hold. She didn't explain what it meant. She didn't have to. Jake had spent enough years hauling cargo through backwater systems to recognize the particular silence of someone deciding, in real time, whether the truth would get them hurt. He got her out of the stasis unit and back to his own ship, the Amara Wren, in the 4 hours it took his suit's air reserve to make the return trip twice. She didn't fight him, which worried him more than if she had. She simply endured it the way you'd endure weather. It was 3 days into her recovery, her stump healing under the ship's basic medbay wrap and her cracked ribs knitting slow under a borrowed brace, before she said anything more than what was necessary to survive the conversation. "You didn't call it in," she said. She was watching him from the cot in the small aft cabin he'd cleared out for her, watching the way a person watches a door they don't trust to stay shut. "Called what in?" "Me. There are brokers who pay for information. Even more who pay for the merchandise itself. Undamaged is better but not required." Her remaining I tracked him as he checked the medbay readouts, utterly unbothered by her own words, as though she were reciting a shipping manifest. "You could have made this trip profitable." "I'm not selling you," Jake said, and something in his own voice surprised him. A flatness, an edge he didn't usually let show. "You're not cargo. I have been cargo for 6 years." She said it without weight, the way you'd state a fact about the weather on a planet you no longer lived on. "Before that, I was a princess of the Thesserine court. Second in line." "Do you know what changed?" Jake didn't answer because he understood by now that this wasn't really a question. "A structural collapse during a diplomatic tour. My hand, my eye, most of the left side of my face. Gone in an instant that wasn't even interesting enough to be called an assassination attempt. Just bad architecture." Her voice didn't waver. It had the smoothness of something worn down by repetition, a story told so many times it had lost its power to hurt the person telling it, or maybe just learned to hide the hurt better. "My people do not put broken things on thrones. Within a season I was quietly removed from the succession, and within a year I was quietly sold. Because a damaged royal is worse than a dead one. A dead one can be mourned. A damaged one is just an embarrassment that keeps breathing." "That's—" Jake stopped, not sure what word fit. Barbaric felt too easy, too much like judgment from a species with plenty of its own ugliness. "That's wrong." "It's efficient," Velnik said. "Different governments define efficiency differently." She studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly. It was the silence of someone recalibrating an instrument that had given the same reading for 6 years and had just, for the first time, returned something strange. "You keep looking at me like you're waiting for me to ask you for something. Aren't you going to?" "I don't have anything left to trade for it," she said. That's usually where the conversation ends. It didn't end. That was the part neither of them expected. Jake wasn't a diplomat, wasn't a doctor beyond what his ship's basic medbay could manage, wasn't anyone particularly important. A solo operator running salvage contracts on the edges of charted space because he liked the quiet and didn't much care for people who needed managing. But he had a stubborn streak that had gotten him fired from 2 corporate salvage outfits before he went independent, and it turned out that streak didn't much care whether the person in front of him was human or not, royal or not, whole or not. He got her a prosthetic hand from a fabricator on a mining station 3 jumps out. Not the cheap kind, the kind that could actually grip a cup without crushing it, because the tech running the shop owed him a favor and Jake decided this was the favor he wanted called in. He didn't ask Velnix if she wanted it. He just handed it to her, still warm from the printer, and let her decide what to do with the silence that followed. She stared at it for a long time before she took it. "Why?" she said. Not a full sentence. She didn't seem to have the rest of the question available to her. "Because you needed a hand," Jake said, like it was the simplest thing in the world, and to him it was, "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She fitted the hand herself, jaw tight with concentration, refusing his help with a stubbornness that reminded him uncomfortably of his own. When the neural calibration finished and the fingers curled, slow and correct, for the first time in 6 years, something in her face changed, not relief exactly. Something more like disbelief that had nowhere to go. "On my homeworld," she said, quiet. "A Thesserine of the royal line who required prosthetic augmentation would be expected to conceal it. Long sleeves, gloves at all functions. A reminder of failure is not displayed at court." "Well," Jake said, "you're not at court." "No," she agreed, flexing the new fingers, watching them move like she still didn't quite believe they belonged to her. "I'm on a salvage ship in the Kepsis Drift with a human who won't tell me what he wants from me. I don't want anything from you." Everyone wants something. Then I want you to stop flinching when I walk into a room, Jake said, and regretted it instantly, because it was truer and more raw than he'd meant to let it be. Velnix didn't answer that. But 3 days later, when he came into the galley, she didn't flinch. 2 weeks after the hand, Jake had to stop at Corvale Station to offload a cargo of scavenged reactor coils. And he brought Velnix along without really thinking about whether that was a good idea. It wasn't until they were walking the concourse together, her still favoring the new hand like it belonged to someone else, that he realized she'd gone rigid beside him, scanning every face they passed the way a soldier scans a tree line. "You don't have to come to the market with me," he said. "You could have stayed on the ship." "I know what happens at markets," she said low, like the words cost her something to say out loud in the open. "I have been sold at 3 of them." Jake stopped walking. "Nobody's selling you here. You don't know that." "I do, actually," he said, and started walking again, slower this time, letting her set the pace. "Because I'm not putting you up for bid, and last I checked, that's usually a required step." She didn't laugh. He hadn't heard her laugh yet, not once. But something in her shoulders eased half a degree, and that was enough for him to call it progress. The trouble, when it came, wasn't trouble at all. A station vendor, an older woman selling dried fruit from 3 systems over, waved Velnix toward her stall with the easy, unbothered friendliness of someone who'd seen every kind of face pass through Corvale and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. "You, with the eyes, one of you or 2 of you, doesn't matter to me. Everybody's got an opinion on my fruit," the vendor said, holding out a slice of something orange and unfamiliar. "Go on. First one's free." Velnix stared at the offered fruit like it might be a test she hadn't studied for. "Why?" "Because you looked hungry and I had extra," the vendor said, already turning to her next customer, already moving on, the exchange over before it had even fully registered as an exchange at all. Velnix held the fruit for a long moment before she ate it. Jake didn't say anything. He'd learned, over 2 weeks, that the moments that mattered most to her were rarely the ones that looked like much from the outside. Not the dramatic rescues, not the speeches, just small, ordinary kindnesses handed over by people who expected nothing back and didn't even remember to feel proud of themselves for it. "On my homeworld," she said later, back aboard the ship, turning the memory over like she still didn't trust it. "A stranger does not give anything away for free. Everything is a transaction. Even kindness is accounted for somewhere, repaid eventually with interest or resented if it isn't." "Sounds exhausting." "It is efficient," she said again, the old word. But this time there was something dry in how she said it, something almost like she didn't fully believe it anymore. "Your species is not efficient at all." "No," Jake agreed. "We're really not. I think," she said slowly, testing the shape of the thought before she committed to it out loud, "I am starting to prefer that." Word travels strangely in the drift, passed hand to hand through traders and station brokers and the kind of people who make a living knowing things other people would rather keep quiet. It took 6 weeks for word of the broken princess, living openly aboard a human salvage vessel, to reach the wrong ears. And when it did, it reached them wrapped in exactly the kind of insult the Thesserine court couldn't ignore. A dead princess was a tragedy. A damaged princess quietly sold off was an unfortunate but manageable embarrassment. Filed away and forgotten. A damaged princess alive and treated, by aliens no less, as though she still mattered, still had a hand worth rebuilding and an opinion worth asking, was a public problem. It suggested, to anyone paying attention, that the court's judgment on what made someone worthy of a throne might have been wrong. Worse, it suggested that other worlds might notice. Jake didn't know any of this when the 2 Thesserine cutters dropped out of transit 30,000 kilometers off his stern. He knew something was wrong the moment his proximity alarm cut through the quiet of a routine cargo run, a sound he hadn't heard outside of drills in over a year. He knew it was serious when Velnix went very still at the sound of it. Not startled, not confused, but recognizing, in the particular way you recognize a voice you spent years hoping never to hear again. "Cutters," she said, before his own scanners had finished the classification. "Enforcement class. They don't send those for cargo disputes. They send them for you. They send them to correct an inconvenience," she said, and for the first time since he'd found her, he heard something under the flatness of her voice. Not fear exactly, but the tired, practiced resignation of someone who had learned that fighting the inevitable only made the ending worse. You should let them board. I'll go quietly. It's cleaner that way, for both of us. No. You don't understand what they'll do to a ship that refuses. Salvage vessels aren't armed for enforcement class anything. I understand, Jake said, already moving for the cockpit, already running the numbers on fuel and thrust, and the very short list of options available to an unarmed hauler facing down 2 military cutters. I heard you the first time. Then why? Because you're not cargo, he said again, the same 3 words, and this time there was nothing gentle in them at all. I already told you that. I don't say things twice because I changed my mind the second time. The hail came through 30 seconds later, translated into rough trade common by his console's language module. A voice cold with the particular boredom of someone who had done this exact job 100 times before and expected no complications this time either. Human vessel, you are in possession of Thesserine Crown property. Surrender the unit designated Velnix Thorin for immediate return processing, and you will not be detained. Jake keyed the response before he'd fully decided what he was going to say, which was, he would later admit, not the most tactically sound way to negotiate with an armed military escort. She's not a unit, he said, and she's not for sale, trade, surrender, or return processing. If you want her, you're going to have to explain to whoever's listening in on this channel exactly why 2 military cutters crossed contested space to reclaim someone your own government already threw away. A pause on the other end, longer than Jake expected, long enough that he wondered if the translation had glitched. You are outmatched, the voice said finally, flatter now, less bored. This is not a negotiation. Then it's a broadcast, Jake said, and reached over and flipped the switch that turned his emergency channel into an open one, the kind that any registered vessel or listening post within 4 light minutes could pick up. It was a bluff mostly, the drift wasn't exactly crawling with witnesses, but bluffs only had to work once. For anyone listening, 2 Thesserine enforcement cutters are currently threatening an unarmed civilian salvage vessel to recover a member of their own royal family that they mutilated, discarded, and sold into slavery 6 years ago for the crime of surviving an accident. I've got the medical scans to prove the mutilation, if anyone wants to see them. Feel free to pass that along. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Jake counted every one of them. They didn't fire. Whatever calculation ran through whatever chain of command sat behind those 2 cutters, it apparently didn't favor an open confrontation broadcast across an unsecured channel in a region where 3 separate trade consortiums had ships passing through on any given week, all of whom would very much enjoy a piece of leverage against the Thesserine court's carefully managed public reputation. The cutters held position for 6 more minutes, long enough that Jake's hands had gone white-knuckled on the console and Velnix had come to stand behind him, silent, watching the tactical display with an expression he couldn't read through the tension in her jaw, and then, without further comment, they broke off and folded back into transit. Jake didn't move for a long moment after they were gone. Neither did Velnix. That shouldn't have worked, she said finally. Lots of things that work aren't supposed to. You bluffed the crown enforcement of an interstellar power with an open comm channel and a threat to embarrass them. She said it slowly, like she was still testing whether the sentence was true. You had no authority to make that threat. You had no way to guarantee anyone was listening. No, Jake agreed. Then why did it work? He thought about it, really thought about it, instead of giving her the easy answer, because she deserved better than a shrug after 6 weeks of learning, piece by piece, that not every kindness came with a price tag attached. Because your people built their whole system on nobody ever calling the bluff, he said finally. They spent so long deciding what a broken princess was worth that they never planned for someone who just didn't play by the same math. Velnix was quiet for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the flatness he'd grown used to. Not gone, exactly, but softer around the edges, like something that had been clenched for 6 years had finally, cautiously, begun to loosen. On my homeworld, she said, worth is measured. Symmetry, capability, what you can perform, what you can survive, what you can be displayed as. I was raised inside that measurement. I believed it even after they used it to discard me. I still believed the measurement itself was fair, that I had simply failed it. She looked down at her new hand, flexed the fingers slowly, the gesture he'd started to recognize as hers alone. A private ritual belonging to no court, no crown, nobody's judgment but her own. You don't measure anything. You just decided I was worth defending, and you never once asked whether I'd earned it. You don't have to earn being treated decently, Jake said. That's kind of the whole point. She stayed. Not because there was nowhere else to go. 6 months later, when word of the standoff had traveled far enough that 3 separate diplomatic offices reached out wanting to formalize her situation. She had options, real ones, offers of asylum and citizenship, and even, quietly, a renewed invitation from a faction within the Thessalonian court that had used the incident to challenge the old succession laws and wanted her back as a symbol of reform. She turned all of it down, at least for now, and told Jake the reason herself, sitting in the galley of the Amara Wren with her new hand wrapped around a cup of something that wasn't quite coffee but was close enough that neither of them minded the difference. They all want to use me for something, she said. The reformists want a symbol. The other offices want a diplomatic asset. Even the kind ones want a story to tell. She looked at him, steady now, both eyes one flesh, one still healing, neither one flinching. You're the only one who ever wanted nothing at all. I wanted you to have a hand that worked, Jake said. That's not nothing. No, he admitted. I guess it isn't. 11 months after Jake Okoro changed course for a distress beacon that shouldn't have mattered, the Thessalonian court quietly amended 6 centuries of succession law, striking the physical integrity clause that had cost a princess her throne over an accident of architecture and bad luck. Velnix Thorin never returned to claim what the law now would have allowed her. She stayed instead where she'd first been handed something without a price attached, running cargo through the Kepsis Drift on a salvage ship named for a woman Jake had never explained and she'd never asked about, learning slowly, deliberately, on her own terms, what it meant to be worth something to someone who had never once needed her to be perfect to prove it. The beacon that started it all was still logged in the Amara Wren's memory banks. 11 years of silence followed by one answer. Jake never deleted it. Some debts, he figured, were worth remembering you'd paid. The end.